that people don't have business problems. They simply have interpersonal problems that show up in the business, but they really struggle to be able to enjoy it. And they experience struggles within their relationships, whether it be relationships with their romantic partner or whether it be in terms of their relationship within themselves. It has to do with the fact that they have unresolved pain. Why is that important? Because your success, no matter how much success you have, will always feel incomplete and insufficient until you've reconciled your pain.
Because the longer you take to make that decision, the more fear comes up and the more you won't end up making that decision. So Jacob, welcome to the show. Really excited to have you here today and dive into, your work and your story. Before we dive into your work today, I'd love to hear your story. What was going on in your life before you got into, coaching and personal development?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me, Michael. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation. But as far as my background is concerned, I started a healthcare tech company with a few other guys back in early 2015. And we grew that company very rapidly from nothing to over $4 million in annual business in about 18 months. So, if you're keeping score, some pretty rapid growth in a very short period of time. We went from, just a few founders to over 31 employees in that time. And it tuned me on to the fact very quickly because of the interpersonal dynamics of scaling a rapidly growing company that people don't have business problems. They simply have interpersonal problems that show up in the business and dictate how they lead, their decision-making, and how they delegate. So after a period of time, I decided, what? I really want to support people with this because this is largely what dictates growth within the business or a lack of growth within the business, and how one experiences the degree to which one experiences fulfillment inside of the business. And because I found myself wildly successful, here we are with this rapidly growing company that I have ownership in, and I'm making more money than I ever have in my life. And yet on some inherent level, I feel empty, unhappy, and unfulfilled. And so I needed to figure out what was the reason for that. What was really behind that, the unconscious inner workings that were largely responsible for that internal feeling. And so that sent me down the path of personal development, as you can imagine. So right around 2015, and left that company in 2018 because I decided that I really wanted to go into supporting CEOs and executives with optimizing for their internal world and aligning their conscious mind so that they can not just experience a greater degree of success within business, but a greater degree of success in their relationships when it comes to their health and their overall peace and happiness, right? Because that's what most people, in my experience, at that level report struggling with. It's not the money, right? They typically have the money game figured out. But what they don't have figured out is how do I access peace? How do I become increasingly more present over time when it comes to my interpersonal relationships, such that I'm able to deepen into intimacy and experience a greater degree of connectedness in those relationships. And so that's what ultimately led me to do the work that I do today. If you've ever seen the show Billions, huge fan. If you haven't, you should probably watch it. But I'm kind of the male version of Wendy Rhodes.
Okay. I love that. Yeah, I think for a lot of people, they focus so much on building their business skills that they take a step back from building just their mindset and, like you said, those skills that they need to build those interpersonal relationships. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, they'll find the success, but they won't find the fulfillment. And they don't find the fulfillment, from what I've seen, is because they don't focus on what is actually going to make them happy. I have friends that, they were able to buy sports cars and all this stuff, but it was just one expense on top of another expense until they ran out of money and they were still unhappy.
Sure.
Do you see this like with a lot of your clients? Do you see kind of that where they're at when they come to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we always want more of what doesn't work, right? So for the vast majority of the men that I work with, yeah, you're absolutely correct. They find themselves playing this zero-sum game. Most of them are unaware of the fact that they're actually playing it. What they are aware of, however, is the fact that they have all of this success, but they really struggle to be able to enjoy it. And they experience struggles within their relationships, whether it be relationships with their romantic partner or whether it be in terms of their relationship within themselves. I mean, I think studies show that over 72% of entrepreneurs suffer from some form of mental illness. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they have unresolved pain. Why is that important? Because your success, no matter how much success you have, will always feel incomplete and insufficient until you've reconciled your pain. So 100%. A lot of men come to me, very rich in money, but poor in happiness. And even if they are doing incredibly well in their business, because most of them are, we all have blind spots, right? And we all have hidden beliefs that prevent us from being successful as we're capable of being, right? Gail Hendricks talks about this in his book. If you're familiar, The Big Leap, he calls it an upper limit problem, right? Well, we're all going to eventually experience an upper limit problem. That's not the question. The question is, will we be equipped to be able to move through that when we encounter it? Right? How effectively and efficiently will we be able to navigate the inherent resistance that is found inside of every upper limit problem such that we can transcend and ascend to the next level?
Love that. No, that's super powerful. When it comes to like your story, and as you were going through building that company, like was there a specific moment or experience that just kind of made you realize that this was the path that you wanted to take? Like this is the way, this is what I need to do?
Yes and no at the same time. So I started going to therapy when I was in my mid-20s. So I started the company 2015. I would have been 29 years old, 30 years old. But several years before that, I started going to therapy because I wanted more for myself. I realized that, if I wanted to grow, then I needed to, either seek after counseling or mentorship. So that drove me to go to therapy. And in therapy, I, acknowledged several things, several experiences that I had growing up, right? Because everything goes back to childhood, that caused me to create certain beliefs about myself, about other people, about the world, about how I fit into the world. And one of those things happened to be the fact that I was sexually abused when I was 12 or 13 years old, which I had never told anyone. And that kind of led to this unraveling where all of a sudden I started to see how so much of my personality was shaped by that incident, by that event. Right. So as you can probably imagine, I started to act as if everything was fine, act as if I was successful, had it all together. I was a 3-sport athlete all through high school. I excelled at academics, went on to play sports in college. And all of that was just truly unconsciously an adaptation or an overcompensation to avoid experiencing pain, or addressing that pain and working through it. So then fast forward, right? Now I'm 30 years old and I'm starting this company, and we're starting to have a lot of success, like I mentioned. And I was in charge of sales. I was the VP of sales. And so I was closing a lot of business. And every win that I had was incredibly short-lived. So I would close a $50,000 deal, a $100,000 deal, a $250,000 deal. And the feeling, like the high that it gave me, it was very brief and momentary. It would last for like a day or two. And then I would go back to feeling the same way. And I was like, why can't I experience this fulfillment, this satisfaction? Why can't I experience that continuously? And the truth is the fact that I had never actually resolved for the abuse that I had experienced. I had acknowledged it in therapy, but then I stopped going. And I was like, oh, let's put that back in that box. Like now that we've, addressed it, I'm going to just kind of, put that back where I found it, type of thing. And this is where the big distinction lies between uncovering something and undoing it. Right. Most men are aware of their problems. That's not the issue. It's the fact that they haven't actually done the necessary work required to undo those experiences such that they can become someone different that is no longer held back by those things. And that's why most men think they're running towards something when in reality they're actually running away from something.
Love that. So, I know a lot of people have different beliefs when it comes to therapy. For me, I've done therapy when I was younger. I was abused as well, physically, mentally. And a lot of times it's good to get, like you say, it's good to get it top of mind. But a lot of the times it's not very good to work through it and to actually heal it. Where I know people that they've been in therapy for 6-7 years, all working on the same thing they started to go there for, and they haven't really healed it or moved through it. They've just kind of let it just float there.
Yeah, that's something that's very common with the men that I work with. It's primarily because, especially with traditional talk therapy and a lot of the men's coaching that's out there today, it's actually just addressing symptoms.
Yep.
It's really good for symptom reduction, but it does very little to get to the root cause issue. And so it's, when you think about that, it's really just teaching people how to cope, which is why you have people that are going to therapy for 5, 6, 7 years, and they're still dealing with the same issues in their life. And so, in our work together, the goal is to, get to the root cause issue so that, we don't have to talk about it anymore. Right? And you can experience a greater degree of growth, in a significantly shorter period of time.
Hell yeah. No, for me, I was physically, emotionally, mentally abused growing up.
Yeah.
I watched my mom get physically, mentally, and emotionally abused by my stepdad. And then I got into drugs. I started selling drugs, and I tell people I was going 3 places. I was either going to be living under a bridge, I was going to be 6 feet under, or I was going to be in prison. Sure. And I found the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, and that book completely changed my life. And then I'd say about 3 years later, I was still kind of dealing with a lot of shit, and I hired my first coach. And honestly, it was the best decision that I've ever made, because they actually helped me work through it instead of just letting it float there in the abyss, just top of mind, always thinking about it. And that's how it was before I hired them. And it's just, coaching is very, very powerful. And I feel like a lot of people need it, but a lot of people are hesitant to pay for it because they don't think that it's going to have the monetary gain.
Yep.
But it really does.
Well, we all have a threshold in terms of what we feel safe to receive, including money, financial abundance, opportunity, and love and intimacy. That threshold is ultimately determined by our current level of emotional intelligence, personal development, and growth and healing. And so when you think about that, I'm very quick to encourage guys when they come to work with me this gets to be a lifestyle for you. If you're really serious about experiencing continuous growth, right, over time, whether it be in your business, whether it be reaching new levels of intimacy and connection in your marriage, in your relationship, this needs to be a lifestyle, because it's just like physical fitness. If you don't use it, you lose it. Right? You've probably, taken a month-long break from going to the gym, and that first workout, once you go back, you're going to be really sore after the fact, right? And that's just after a month break, right? What if you were to go a year? You would lose a lot of your gains that you had built up over time previously. The same is true for this work, right? Our brain is wired to a victim mindset, to blame other people and other things outside of ourselves for our current level of results, whatever those results are with regard to. That's our default. Internal locus of control, right? I am the source of every result in my life, good or bad. That has to be cultivated over time. And it's cultivated through continuous interpersonal work, right? So without continuous personal development, you are all that you will ever become right now.
Yep.
And so that's something that I'm always very quick to emphasize with the guys that come to work with me. It's not me saying that you need to work with me for, ad nauseum, or indefinitely. But I'm always very quick to say, like, if you don't continue this in some way, shape, or form after, our work together has concluded, right? Just like with physical fitness, you're going to lose your gains over time. Right. Yep. So my encouragement is that if you really hope to see the long-term fruit of this work, right, in your life, in your relationships, then make sure that you're consistent, because consistency is the key to success in anything.
Exactly. No, I totally agree. So I know you kind of mentioned like seeing clients achieve huge financial gains, but they really struggle with like that peace and happiness. Like, what got you interested in really kind of looking beyond the financial metrics of success and looking more at more like the qualitative side of success?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure you've probably experienced this yourself in some way, shape, or form, but money is just an amplifier. And so if you struggle to be fulfilled without money, a greater degree of money is only going to amplify that. You'll experience happiness for a short period of time, right? Because now all of a sudden you're able to buy your dream car, like you talked about. You're able to buy a house, but ultimately you're going to return back to your baseline level of happiness. Right? So if we are actually going to create a shift, right, and experience upward trajectory as it relates to your ability to increase your felt sense of happiness and peace, nothing outside of you is going to solve for that. And so that's why I talked about it being a zero-sum game. Most men are just chasing after the next level or more, but the next level only makes you want the next level, and more only makes you want more. So you realize very quickly that it's a very fleeting, empty game to be playing, which is why all of our problems tend to be psychological, but all of our answers are always spiritual. A renovation of the heart. Yeah.
Would you say that you bring like Christianity or anything like that into your teachings, or like what? So, how do you define spiritual?
So, I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole, like the distinction between religion and spirituality. But nevertheless, what I would say, I'm a man of faith. I ascribe to be a Christian. But for me, my purpose is to simply invite you into faith. It's to put you on the path towards a higher purpose and a higher power, whatever that looks like for you, right? If you're interested in hearing about what I believe, and you're interested in hearing more about Jesus, of course, I'm happy to, open the door to that and have a conversation with you about it.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, those two things seem to be the only thing that suffice. Most men think they're after success, but they're really, really not. So in my work, it's uncovering the unconscious motivation beneath one's conscious desire, because our unconscious is reality, right? It's the truth. And for most men, in my experience, they don't actually want what they want. They want something deeper, oftentimes that they're not currently in relationship to. And so until we uncover what that is, right, for me, it was acceptance, right? What drove my ambition was acceptance, right? So ambition was just a proxy that had me continuing to play this zero-sum game in which nothing or no amount of success or money was ever going to fill that internal void. That's this deconstruction component that we work on with guys, where we address the internal blocks and barriers within them that keep them from greater success. And then eventually, once that work is done, we begin the process of reconstruction, right? Which looks like making something new. And, they go from playing the money game to something significantly deeper and more meaningful.
Now for for the acceptance side of it, I know like that's one thing that I struggled with, is I wanted everybody to like me. I wanted everybody to accept who I was. And I do think that was very, very much tied into the abuse that I went through.
Of course.
And I'm sure that is probably something that you were dealing with as well, is, going through that can, like, any sort of abuse, like, you just feel so little because you've gone through it, and you just you end up portraying this person, kind of like you said at the beginning, where it's just, you're trying so hard to be somebody that essentially you're really not, because of wanting that acceptance. And
correct.
Yeah. So I can definitely relate to that 100%.
Right. Which is largely, it may not be abuse, but it's largely what is driving most men's efforts today, right? Their pursuit of creating this ideal image or this ideal situation in which they have the house, the car, the boat, whatever, as an whatever it may be, as an unconscious attempt to claim victory over their pain, over their insecurities. Because what you described was exactly what I experienced, which was this complete fracture of my self-esteem upon being sexually abused that I then needed to compensate for. And so how did I compensate for it? Because at that age, 12, 13, I'm not sure how old you were when you went through your experiences, but you don't really know what to do with that pain. Yeah. And so you have to find a way to cope. And an incredible way to cope is to become highly ambitious and driven towards success. Some people, they turn to alcohol and drugs. Other people just turn to, looking good and making money, or working out and accomplishing this ideal physique. That's certainly not me discouraging you from working out. Again, it's just uncovering the unconscious motivation beneath the conscious behavior, so that we can actually address that which is getting in the way of you experiencing true success and fulfillment.
Yeah, I mean, I was both. was addicted to drugs. And then when I started selling cannabis, I just kind of got addicted to the quick money that I could make from that.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
tried to just portray myself as this person that had a lot of money. I was going and I'd spend like $3 or $4 grand a month on cocaine, and then just pass it around to my friends, pass around weed to my friends, and then go to, like, because I lived in Minnesota, so we were right down from the Mall of America. So I would just go to the Mall of America, just go to like the Burberry store and just buy a bunch of designer clothes and just think that I was just trying to like make myself look wealthy when really I was just trying to cover up. Yeah. My mom was in that relationship from when I was 1 till I was 16. So I kind of was going through that for a long time. He was a meth dealer, and
oh man, I'm sorry to hear that.
Like, yeah, so he did meth, was a meth dealer. I was young, like found meth pipes and stuff in the house, found drugs, and like there was a lot of shit that I seen that I like no kid should see for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, an unconscious attempt at claiming, victory over your pain, right? The ego loves dressing up, right? That's the primary concern of the ego, right? It's being right and looking good. So it's a completely natural, normal response.
Yeah.
And I would go so far as to say, a necessary stage of psychological development. The big issue for most men is that they get stuck there, right? They get stuck in the compensating phase or stage of psychological development that we were always meant to break out of and break free from, so that we can be put on the path towards a higher purpose and a higher power.
Yeah. So when you were growing up, were you like raised in a spiritual household or anything like that?
I was raised in the conservative Christian church, but I largely ran from it and wanted very little to do with it. I went along with going to church, and I wasn't outwardly rebellious because I lived in such a small town that I wanted to be accepted by my friends because I didn't really have any choice. It's like, these are your friends because there's nobody else. And so I went along with it all. But you have to leave the garden. And so I left the garden, and I was like, okay, I'm good. I don't really want anything to do with this anymore. Largely because it was about rules, right? And that's what most religion is. It's a set of rules, right? It's all about, correct thinking or correct thought and morality. True healthy religion is not primarily about morality. It is by corollary and implication, but first and foremost, it's about transformation.
Yep.
And that's where most religions, especially most Christian denominations within the West, have completely lost the plot. And this is why membership is waning, or at least has been up until very recently, to an incredible degree, because they've made it about morality. They've made it about a set of rules, right? It's about my signpost, my denomination, my beliefs, which are always better than your beliefs, by the way, or your denomination. And it's about being right. And that's not what true healthy religion was ever supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about, transformation and becoming a new creation. And then by implication, right, you become more moral. So I ran from it. I was kind of covertly rebellious in that way.
Yeah, I think a lot of us did. I know I grew up Catholic, so we were like, my mom wasn't as like strict as her mom was, or her, or like my great grandma.
Yeah,
where they would like make you sit down, do the entire rosary, strict. If they found out we didn't go to church on Sunday, then they were having a conversation with my mom about it and stuff like that. So like I got baptized, I got my first communion, I did like confirmation and like went through all this stuff. And then once I was done with it, and I think one of the big things that really kind of made me run away was everything that I faced as a child. I was like, how could there be a God if he let somebody so young go through so much pain? And now I have like a completely different perspective on it. I'm like, he put me through that. So that way I could gain the power that I need to go like fulfill the mission that he put me on this earth to fulfill.
Yeah. The way that I like to put it is that grace creates the void that grace alone can fill. Right. Put another way, God creates the void. God creates the void that God alone can fill. We, of course, look for God in everything but God, which is supposed to happen, right? Right. Like me, I looked for it in work, in women, right? All of these material external things, only to be like, oh wow, this is really empty. This is not fulfilling, at least not long term. I need to find something different, and that's what put me on the path back to God. Right. So 100%, I totally agree with you in that it's his way of eventually and ultimately drawing us back to himself.
Oh yeah. I like that. I like super like simple way to put it but very, very powerful as well. You talk about this idea that men are often unconsciously enslaved by the need to,
be a better version of themselves.
Yeah. Like how do you help your clients break free from that while still like being able to grow?
Well, I think so it was Carl Jung that talked about life being divided into two halves. The first half is all about self-actualization and individuation, right? Making something of myself, right? Establishing myself, becoming successful, right? Accomplishment, achievement, and the pursuit of power, possession, and prestige, as the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr says. The second half of life is very different. The second half of life is all about transformation and transcendence. And so in the first half of life, you're supposed to play that game, right? Like the money game that I talked about, right? So you take on this identity that you think is you, but is not you, right? Often referred to in the Bible as the flesh. Another word, I believe, is just the false self. Same thing, just said in a slightly different way, right? So you take on this identity that, helps you get paid and get laid. And then it's ultimately, that high performance game that most men are playing, right? It kind of needs to fall apart because you start to see through it, right? You realize what it actually is, right? The unconscious motivation or intention beneath the conscious behavior or desire, which very few people are actually in touch with. Like I mentioned, for me, it was ambition as a proxy for acceptance. And so what typically tends to happen when men begin to break out of this phase or stage of psychological development is they need to go through a struggle, right? A necessary struggle that is bigger than them. It's stronger than their willpower, than their acquired mental resources or faculties, etc. And that seems to be the thing that that seems to be the only thing that will get them to break out of like their egocentric preoccupation with success, with money, with material possession, with influence, right? Needing to be recognized and acknowledged. The true self doesn't need any of that, by the way. It doesn't need any of that. In fact, the true self craves simplicity. It really does, because I think Biggie said it best, right? More money, more problems. You know, I used to think that I wanted to own houses, you know, like in Florida and Colorado and all of these different places. And, you know, I own a home in California, and the moment you get a taste of what it's like to manage a property from 1,800 miles away, you're like, yeah, I don't really want that. Like, it sounds cool, like to have these houses in all of these different places. And then you actually start to do it and you're like, this is a headache, man. This is, you know, because of course I have someone managing the property, but who's managing the managers? Well, that falls on me. Yeah. Or I have to pay someone to manage the managers, but who has to right? You see where I'm going with this? It's just this endless cycle, all of which, you know, requires that I make even more money. So, you know, and that comes with a lot of pressure, you know, because if you own a company, you know, you understand that once you've built it to a certain degree, you have to keep on making money in order to keep the whole thing going, you know, in order to pay your employees. And that can be truly liberating, especially if you have a really solid team around you. But, you know, I don't really want to work 8 to 10 hours a day. You know, my profit margins now are better with just me and my assistant than they were when I had 5 employees and I was making significantly more money.
Yeah.
You know, so what is it that I'm really after, right? Which requires a reorientation around what is most important. And you realize very quickly, especially once you have a family, that what you really want, can't actually be bought.
100%. Which kind of brings me to another concept you talk about, which is like in order to have a significant breakthrough, it requires dying to something, whether that's in business, relationships, or health. And you kind of like shared a couple examples there. But could you like walk us through what that actually looks like in practice?
Yeah, 100%. So, yeah, the way that I have put it before is that true transformation is always predicated on dying to something, letting something go, allowing a part of myself to die, whatever that looks like. But that's why so many people are attracted to self-help, right? Which I would just say is like bogus self-help on your own terms, right? So the path of transformation, it truly is construction, deconstruction, reconstruction. I've kind of talked about it and hinted at it earlier in this conversation, but to put it all together for you, that's the kind of the sequence of events that we have to go through in order to experience true lasting growth. Now, the kicker to that is it's not like a one-time thing. Jesus talks about in scripture, like Paul talks about in scripture, I die daily, right? And so this is a continuous process of both death and rebirth, such that we continue to experience sanctification, or, this process of becoming whole or holy, or embodying my true and authentic self as God designed me to be. And so, right, but we don't typically like that process because, it involves shedding, pruning, right? If you think about a fruit tree, we have to prune it in order for it to yield the best fruit. But that process is inherently painful for the tree because it requires that we remove or cut off significant parts of it. And so this is why, you've probably heard the saying before, your new life is going to cost you your old one. Right? But the ego doesn't want that, because the ego hates change. The ego wants to maintain the status quo.
Have you ever read the book Ego is the Enemy?
I have, yeah.
Great
but I think we're talking about we're talking about two different types of ego, Ryan Holiday and myself, right? I'm kind of talking about the self-protective part of your psyche that seeks to maintain the status quo. But nevertheless, he's 100% onto something. I don't necessarily believe it's the enemy, because that has us fighting against it or resisting it. And, what we resist persists, which I'm sure you've heard before. So what I might suggest as a more integral path to wholeness involves just that. It involves integrating your ego in a healthy way, such that you continue to make space for it, but you just do so consciously as opposed to unconsciously. Right? And that's why so much of our work involves bringing what is unconscious to the conscious level, because what we're aware of, we're in control of, but what we're unaware of is in control of us.
That kind of makes me think about one of your recent posts on dual awareness, like the ability to hold views simultaneously.
Oh man, you want to go down this road, especially with the election? I'm all here for it. I really am, because single issue voting has become our new favorite form of dualistic thinking. Right? And
a lot of people,
it's such a trap.
Yeah, from what I've heard, like a lot of people didn't vote for Kamala; they just voted against Trump. And I think a lot of people can't hold these different. They don't have that
tensions.
Dual awareness where it's
Correct.
either this side or it's this side. It can't be like they can't look at both.
Yeah.
And be logical about it. There's always emotion that
Correct.
drives them, and
right. Well, because that has to be cultivated, right? Yeah. Non-dualistic thinking, both and thinking, that has to be cultivated. It's just like a muscle. If you want to strengthen a muscle, right, you have to stretch it. Most people are 100%. They're trapped in dualistic thinking. This or that, either or thinking, not both and thinking. And so it has them constantly divided, constantly experiencing and living into separateness or separation, right? They can't see the inherent truth on the other side. They won't acknowledge it, right? It'll fly right over their head for the sake of continuing to operate in that mindset and continuing to be right about whatever they believe, right? Because that's one of the primary concerns of the ego. And so much of our work is in breaking people out of that thinking, right? Because unless you do, you'll never actually be free. You'll continue to be run, right, by your ego, by emotion, right, which you alluded to, and that was ever present throughout the whole process of this election, right, where you have people just just a little bit, right, because dual awareness, it invites us to hold two opposing views while giving both equal weight, right? The enemy, if you really take a step back and look at it, it's not a certain politician or a certain party. It's the system that we've been put in that continues to divide us, that continues to keep us separate and have us attacking one another. Right? Every victim needs a villain. And, and as you put it, so many people simply, made Trump into this villain that they needed to fight against. And you're a marketer. It's so fascinating to look at both of their campaigns from a marketing perspective, because you're 100% correct. So much of Harris's campaign was built on the back of being against something and not for something, which is always more empowering, by the way. Trump, on the other hand, I actually saw statistics talking about this yesterday. He spent 80% of his time talking about one thing, and that's the economy.
Yep.
What has impacted everyday Americans more than anything else over the past 4 years? Because COVID was going on 5 years ago now, right? What has impacted people more than anything? It kind of started with COVID, but really it's been the cost of living, inflation, and the overall state of the economy.
100%.
And that's what he spent, according to these statistics that I saw in the news. Who knows if they're actually accurate, but if we assume they are, he spent the majority of his time talking about the economy and being for turning the economy around. Right?
It was that and then health. Once
Correct.
he partnered up with Robert Kennedy, then he brought in a lot about health. And I think that's one thing that a lot of Americans are realizing that we're missing.
100%. Yep. And I'm actually, a moderate. I would, if I were to classify myself as anything, it would be as a libertarian, right? Which is being able to see the truth on both sides, right? And weigh what each candidate is prioritizing, right? Whatever they're running their campaign around. But if I'm looking at it objectively, it was so hard for people to get behind Harris because psychologically, even if they weren't consciously thinking this, if you look at the entirety of her campaign, it's like, well, what do you actually stand for? Right? What are you going to do for me? And from a marketing perspective, right, if you have an online business or if you're an entrepreneur, a service provider, if the promise isn't clear, people are inherently going to reject it because there's confusion there or there's a lack of certainty there. But with Trump, there was no lack of certainty because he spent the majority of his time talking about the economy and improving health. Who's not going to get behind that?
Yeah.
And of course, his results speak to it. He got elected.
Yeah. Did you watch Russell Brunson did a breakdown of all of their marketing campaigns, from their funnels to their cause and stuff like that. And he's like, I went back to, I think it was the early 1900s and was looking at what do all the presidents that won have in common. And
interesting. Okay.
Almost every single one that won had a future cause-based message, like make America great again, make America healthy again. Let's make the economy great again. And all the ones that lost had this message about fixing what's fixing what's happening right now. It's like a present-based cause instead of the future-based cause. And it was super interesting to watch the breakdown. If you want, I can send you the video.
I'd love to see it.
It's 30 minutes long, but super interesting. My wife and I watched it while we were in Utah over the last. We just got back. We were gone for a month.
Cool.
But yeah, super, super interesting.
Negatively motivated versus positively inspiring.
Yep.
And so it so perfectly, honestly, speaks to, I believe, the transformation that we're all called to. But nevertheless, the journey that we all need to go through if we are really to access, the peace that surpasses all understanding. is once we have gone through this deconstruction process, we can no longer focus on fighting the old. We have to step into creating the new, right? Which is what Trump's campaign was largely based off of, which is why people found so much promise in it.
That, and there was just so much, like, there was hate on both sides. I think, like, we can definitely say that, but the one thing that Kamala did wrong was, like, a week before the election, she was talking to a group of older voters, and she started talking about how the 18 through 20, I think it was 18 to 24-year-olds are stupid and they can't make solid decisions. And I guess this went everywhere. I didn't hear about it until yesterday when I was sitting down. I go to, like, a cigar lounge down the street from my house, and they're all Republicans there. And they were, like, talking about everything that was, like, going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, and if you look at it, the stats, 54% of that age group actually voted for Trump.
Oh yeah. It's not surprising, you know. The power of being, you know, for peace as opposed to against war is a really significant distinction, and I think in many ways influenced why Trump ultimately won and Harris ultimately lost. But it is such a wonderful metaphor, honestly, for, you know, how our unconscious approach to life and to living, right? You know, going back to what I said before, most men think they're running towards something when in reality they're actually running away from something. And they typically come into relationship with that not until after they've accomplished what Thomas Merton, who was a Franciscan friar, he coined it as your personal salvation project, right? Which is largely built around me and my success. You know, it's typically in that moment when you awake to the reality of the game that you've been playing.
Love it. So, like, looking ahead, like, what's the bigger vision for the next, like, 5 to 10 years? What are you hoping to create with your business?
You know, it's interesting that we're having this conversation because for such a long time, I had very significant goals for myself. As long as I can remember, going back to, you know, when I was in college, or excuse me, when I was in high school, arguably middle school. And life right now for me looks like not having any goals and just learning to abide and savor what I have and the life that I've built. Because I have a really good life. I live in a really nice house. I have a vacation home in California, and I don't need for a lot right now in my life, which is I realize a very privileged, you know, place to be that most people don't find themselves in. But for me personally, I'm no longer waiting for the future to be better than the present. And that's a really liberating place for me at this time. But powerful. As far as my thanks, only took me 38 years to get here. But as far as my work is concerned, it's ever since I started my coaching business almost 7 years ago, I've always been focused on achieving mastery as opposed to money. And obviously, I think you should aspire to both, you know, especially if you want to continue to take care and provide for your family in this economy with, you know, how much inflation has gone up and the value of the dollar has gone down. So it's not a either or conversation. It's certainly a both and, but mastery, it's slow. It's arduous. There's really no shortcuts. And so for me, it looks like, how can I achieve the greatest degree of deep impact in my clients? And that looks like continuing to better equip myself and educate myself over time and invest in becoming the best at my craft. And so much of my work looks like continually becoming a better and better coach over time. And that requires a lot of investment, right? Continuing to invest in my education, in training, in reading, gaining wisdom, insight, and that requires a lot of study. And so I'm putting a lot of time into doing that so that I can serve the few who serve the many. But to be honest with you, I don't have these large, audacious goals for my business. It's continuing to support the few that serve the many and trusting that will be the thing that has a really big impact. But practically speaking, continuing to promote the book that I launched about a year and a half ago, and we'll soon be starting work on my second book.
Nice. I like that.
Yeah.
And then final question for someone that's listening right now who's feeling called to make a change in their life, but they're feeling stuck. Like, what would you want them to know?
What would I want them to know? Well, in my experience, it's impossible to be stuck. That's not actually a thing. You're stuck because you're putting off making a decision, right? It's indecision that causes us to be stuck, because decisions are what create momentum, and momentum moves us forward. So when someone tells me that they're stuck, it tells me that they're just putting off something, whether it be a decision, whether it be a conversation, whether it be an action that they know they need to take, maybe making a pivot. And so my encouragement would be to run as fast as you possibly can in the direction of that conversation, of making that decision, right? Which is why I think there's a lot of truth to what they say when they talk about how, the biggest breakthroughs that you're looking for are found on the other side of the things that you're avoiding. I think there's a ton of truth to that. Yeah. But you can't be stuck. That's not a thing. You're either progressing or you're regressing. In my experience, there's really no in between.
And one thing I like to say is time is like fuel to fear, because the longer you take to make that decision, the more fear comes up and the more you won't end up making that decision. So the shorter you can the shorter amount of time that you can be like, okay, I'm going to do this, give myself 24 hours to think about it and then make that decision. Sometimes even 24 hours is too much. Sure. Like if you're going to go jump out of a plane and you give yourself 24 hours to think about it, I can guarantee you're probably not going to jump out of a plane.
You're probably not going to do it. Yeah, no, you're 100% correct, because why do people put off making decisions? It's because of fear, fundamentally. Right. Yeah. What that fear is in regard to is different depending on the situation. But you're 100% correct. The longer you put off making that decision, you only further reinforce that fear, right? Which means taking action on down the road becomes that much more difficult, because now you have that much more fear to overcome.
Love it. Well, Jake, this has been awesome. Where can people find you, learn more about your work, maybe grab your book? And
sure,
maybe even get on a waiting list for the next book that's coming out.
Oh man, thank you for the idea. I should probably put together a waiting list. But the best place to interact with me is on Instagram or Facebook. Instagram, it's really easy to find me. I am Jake Kauffman. That's Kauffman. Otherwise, you can pick up my book on Amazon. It's called Let Love In by Jacob Kauffman. So it's my full name. Again, that's Kauffman.
Love it. Well, man, again, appreciate you coming on here, and I can't wait to continue to watch you, grow in your business. Can't wait to continue to read your posts, and yeah, it's great to be connected.
You too, Michael. Thanks again for having me. Enjoyed the conversation.
Of course. Thank you.